Boris, stop. I can't leave this on a very positive note while still being honest. So overall, I can't believe I'm saying this. So before Boris Johnson, our UK Prime Minister, became who he is today, of which the kind of quality I won't comment on here, but you can imagine my thoughts, I've expressed them before. He was, among many things, a fiction writer. I know. He was a newspaper columnist. He was also an awful mayor who spent all of our money on ancient water blasters, but that's a story for another day. He was also a fiction writer, and he wrote this book, 72 Virgins. And because I am a masochist and self-harm is apparently the name of my game when it comes to reading this year, I thought I would start the year off right and make the first book I read in 2021 purposefully the worst book. Like, let's find out how bad this book actually is. This man has been ruining my life for the past 2 years minimum. He's actually achieved the incredible feat of making me miss Theresa May. And because I'm always saying, you know, we should listen to our enemies, we should give them the time of day, hear them out before we fight them tooth and nail for justice. I'm gonna give this a read now. Obviously bought it secondhand. As much as I'd like to contribute to his 100 grand renovation of his state-funded flat, I bought this secondhand on the internet. And the most interesting thing about this object was the fact that I found a bookmark on page 44. So whoever gave this away and sold it on for secondhand only got that far. So that's not making me feel hopeful. The obvious, incredibly problematic implications of the title, 72 Virgins, isn't exactly warming my heart, but I'm gonna give it a go. Let's see how it is. It was, after all, published by one of the biggest publishers in the UK, owned by Rupert Murdoch, but one of the biggest publishers in the UK. So it can't be all that bad, right? 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 Right?
Forgive me.
Guten Morgen, Frau everyone. Welcome to Camp Self-Destruction, Occupants 1. Here we go. It's 7:26 in the morning. It's completely pitch dark outside, and I have a feeling my soul is about to become the same way. Let's read the blurb together, shall we? The American president, on a state visit to Britain, is leaving a major address to a top-level audience in Westminster Hall. Despite the efforts of the finest security minds, events begin to spin out of control. A remarkable new worldwide reality TV show dominates the airway. Reality TV? And the most unlikely heroes emerge. If the unlikely hero is a bumbling, unqualified Etonite, then I will eat my cap and gown. Page 1, let's go. Oh my god, the book starts at this time. Maybe I can read it along. It starts at 7:52. Destiny. Okay, so we made it to page 56, which is further than the last owner of this book, so I think that's an accolade in itself. I have a lot to say, but first I feel like I need a jog and a shower. So we're gonna do that, and then we're gonna do a tiny little debrief. Oh, okay, so overall, I can't believe I'm saying this. The writing is actually more than okay. It's pretty good. I guess that is one of his professions. He's a journalist. He has a way with words, I guess. It actually hurts me to say that, but stylistically, it's not painful to read. However, there were some points of what the fuckery. At the moment, and like this is obviously because I'm just getting used to the characters in the book, but maybe also because of the writing, it's a kind of jumbled storyline from many perspectives. One of the perspectives is of a traffic warden who is black and has a quota to fill. One perspective is from some, it would seem, about to be terrorists who happen to be of Arabic descent. A sniper who is sitting on the top of Parliament ready to protect the President of the USA who is visiting Parliament. Bear in mind this is written in 2004, 2005, so Donald Trump was just a twinkle in our eye. And most interestingly, the perspective of an MP. But some of this is like very reflective of what could be now going on in his brain. You gotta listen, gather round my friends, listen at the fire. Barlow's thoughts of political extinction had taken a philosophical turn. Did it matter? Of course not. The fate of the human race was hardly affected. The sun would still, at an appointed date 4 billion years hence, expand to the girth of a red giant and devour the planet. Boris, stop. It's almost like you care about climate change. In the great scheme of things, his extermination was about as important as the accidental squishing of a snail. The trouble was that until that happy day when he was reincarnated as a louse or a baked bean, he didn't know how he was going to explain the idiotic behaviour of his brief human avatar. We don't actually yet know what this politician has done, but he's done something pretty irrevocable and embarrassing, and he's expecting for the comment on that to turn up in the papers. So he's thinking, I've done something really wrong, how am I going to get out of this, how am I not going to lose face? And today, at the time of recording, is the year of our Lord, the 13th of January, and yesterday me and Craig spent our lunchtime witnessing him doing just that.
To them and to this house I offer my heartfelt apologies.
So rowdy, isn't it?
He's really shaken up, isn't he? Look at him.
We just need to wait to find out whether I did attend the party, because I'm not sure. So that's a wow. There's also just a few editorial things that I think maybe if it was published today would have been changed by an editor, and are just a bit weird, a weird thing for him to have written down. But just like when he talks about the 4 Arabic men sitting in a cafe, he calls them the 4 dark customers, and that's not like anybody's narrative voice. There is a lot of like people in this book so far that are being prejudiced towards each other. There's a lot of that, but it's clear that it's all kind of in the tone of the character. It's not an authorial voice apart from that sentence. However, he drops 2 N-bombs in quick succession and in the narrative voice of a character who is black, but still the context is that it's the traffic warden who is listing a list of words that people have used to be horrific to him, and that is, the N-word is one of the words that he lists, but it just feels so completely unnecessary. But that was something that really did, like, I was really taken aback, and I don't think would have been published now. You freaking hope so. But that was concerning. There's also some funny stuff about how the politician that is going everywhere, he like rides on his bike and he talks about how great it is to use a bike on the nose. Anyway, we march on, perhaps towards our own destruction, but we march on. Oh hey, hi, hello. Let me catch you up on what you have missed. I am now on page 62. I honestly don't think a lot of people know this book exists, and I cannot tell whether that is a good or a bad thing, but mainly my feelings at the moment are boredom. I'll be honest, it's boredom. It's boredom. I tried to think of another word, but I think boredom is the word. As you can see, I've tabbed up a lot of things to say to you, but I honestly feel bored just thinking about reopening those pages. I honestly think it's something to do with how sparse the actual plot is, but how thick the text is. It kind of feels like Ron Weasley's homework. Like, you had enough thoughts to fill a paragraph, but instead you have to hand in a whole essay, so you're meeting it out as much as possible. Essentially, what has happened since we last spoke is that the terrorists have got into the car park of Parliament. Yet that is literally all the progress we've got, but we're following so many characters that we now have all of their backstories, where they went to school, what their favourite hobbies were growing up, what their various traumas are. And yeah, I guess that is like a literary trope, like people do that in books, but these are all so tangential and so thick and really prohibit the plot so much that I feel like I am in some kind of time vortex where I keep pushing through like a glob of hot sludge, like slowly making its way down the road, but never really getting there. Or like the sloth guy from Zootopia, like that's how I feel. I want to feel optimistic and feel like all of this character padding has a reason for it, but at the moment it honestly feels like a word count stuffer. And I know that because I've been one of those people. I have stuffed an essay, I'll say it, but I haven't printed and replicated and trying to sell it for $7.99. Okay, let's just continue. Okay. So I finished the book. I actually think this became way less fun and way more serious a video and a reading experience than I thought it was going to be. And of course, what do I know? I'm just a girl wearing an Art Attack jumper and far too much blue eyeshadow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Quick summary of what happened at the end, hopefully followed by if we can learn anything from this experience of the reading, of the thinking, and if I would ever do it again. Towards the end of the book, pacing stopped being an issue. It actually became kind of fast-paced. The end of the book basically culminates in the 4 terrorists taking hold of Westminster Hall, where POTUS is making a speech. They take over, they threaten everybody, they've got these like bomb vests on them that will explode if they die, so they can't be shot because if their heart stops it will trigger the bomb. And they basically say, look, there's loads of people from around the world being held in Guantanamo Bay without having fair trial or being sent back to their own countries. We think that's really unfair. We are also Islamic terrorists, but our main point today is that you let these people go, and we would like the people at home to vote on whether those people should be let out. It divulges into a kind of comedy of errors where the terrorists make some mistakes, the politician makes some mistakes, and they do in the end regain control of the hall. But in that intermediary period, there's an interesting thing going on fictionally around the world where people are asked to vote for or against America. So lots of countries come out for and against what they perceive to be not just the Guantanamo Bay issue, but also just America and the USA in general. It raises some interesting points about what is the moral obligation of the press to keep broadcasting or to shut off the cameras, to take the vote seriously and actually report on the voting, or to not collaborate with the terrorists at all. And there was also some really interesting speeches in there from the terrorist characters themselves, in which it shows that maybe Boris Johnson does have a very good idea of why people might be anti-West, why they have been disenfranchised by the complete lies and horrible actions of Western governments, and that was more filled out than I was expecting it to be honest. The end of the book did have a ridiculous tone of, and everything worked out and everyone went home, which is probably not how it worked out. And I think maybe my experience of this book was slightly darkened by, one, the use of like racial slurs in a place that there didn't need to be any, there was no point being made. There was basically a list of horrible things this person had been called, and there was no need to list those things explicitly. It was just reckless, pointless, don't know why they printed it. But also what overshadowed my reading of this book was the fact that terrorist events were going on, quite similar to this one, while I was reading the book, and it just became so like not funny. And I think there's 2 ways that you can read the book. You can either just read it as a comedy of errors where everybody's perspectives are vaguely represented and you do get a backstory as to why each character is acting the way they are, and they're all largely quite empathetic and sympathetic to the way each character has turned out, whether that's a bumbling MP who is pretty shit at his job, an objectified female assistant who's beautiful but nobody really cares about what she has to say and she's been disenfranchised by that, whether it's the President of America himself or the terrorists that are taking over Westminster Hall. They all kind of got a backstory and a fullness of character that I wasn't expecting from Boris, to be honest. So it could be seen as this kind of comedy of errors where you just see the same situation from loads of different perspectives. However, there were lots of jokes in here, I won't read them all out, about how the reason the terrorists got through was because people were being overly PC. Like every time the terrorists claimed to be a news organisation, but the security were really suspicious of it, politicians would stop them in the corridor and be like, I think it's actually really great that we've got diverse news, and if you strip search these men, I think that would be kind of racist. And that is why the terrorists get in to Westminster Hall and get to take control of everything. So I think there is a commentary there, perhaps by accident or maybe on purpose, to suggest that if you're too anti-racist you could cause a terrorist attack, which is more complicated than this book could be bothered to explore, but also didn't actually explore it, just suggested it, so the people who already think that way would be like, yes, totally agree. So that was a mindfuck. But in general, what I think I found so disturbing about this book wasn't that it was bad, because in so many ways it was bad, but it also had more depth than I was expecting, and just paragraph to paragraph was written quite well. He'd obviously attempted to see the world from all these different kind of perspectives, and there was a real presence of empathy throughout it. And that kind of got me to thinking, about the presence of empathy within people we disagree with. And it also reminded me of this book I read called Against Empathy, which I kind of started reading because I disagreed with the premise, and I came around to seeing the author's perspective on. One of his points is Empathy doesn't necessarily mean that you are good, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're having a good impact on the people you're empathizing with or the world. You don't necessarily need to empathize to respond and recognize somebody's pain and do the right thing. And at the same time, you can feel an incredible amount of empathy and still be a complete twat. The idea of reading a book evoking empathy, and indeed the idea of writing a book giving you more empathy, isn't necessarily gonna bring you to a place where you actually get round to helping the person or actioning the learning. Empathy is, I am embodying you, I am crying your tears, I feel your pain. And compassion is, I am not you, I recognize I cannot feel what you are feeling, but I recognize you as human, I care about you, and therefore I am going to act. Reading this book came at an interesting time for me because I think I am reframing my idea of books. Like, how, in what ways do they help people, in what ways are they not necessarily as helpful as we frame them as, or at least not universally. And it's devastating in the case of Boris Johnson, and again with our famous creator of Wizarding Worlds, is that in the art that they produce, they display a certain ability for empathy that they then go on in later life to completely forget to act on, to choose power over. And it also reminded me of this quote from Nadia Gordemir, who, when talking about this idea of like being a writer and therefore being a good person, said, the powers of observation heightened beyond the normal imply extraordinary disinvolvement, or rather the double process, excessive preoccupation and identification with the lives of others, and at the same time a monstrous detachment. The tension between standing apart and being fully involved, that is what makes a writer. So when I characterize Boris Johnson, I think that is kind of what is so monstrous about him, is that he has a world-class education, he clearly has some intellect.
Supine protoplasmic invertebrate jellies.
He's gone through lots of exercises of empathy, and yet Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is still in prison because of his carelessness, and he hasn't really done that much to try and get her out. That's a very small example, but an ironic one considering everything he seems to know about world politics and the hatred of the West. His complete callousness for other people's lives during the pandemic, and just generally this display of like me over you, I know what I could do but I'm not going to. And then I guess the question comes, when we think about these people that we used to admire maybe, or I don't know if I ever admired Boris Johnson, but I definitely admired some other people that have gone pretty downhill, is that we expect this trajectory of people's lives where they become better and better people, and they become more and more selfless and get more and more wisdom. And I think maybe as a trauma response, as a privilege response, some people go the other way, they go downhill. And how do we treat the art that they make on the way? Do we read it from when they seemingly were better people, or at least people who were trying, although debatable with this book, but I guess there are parts where I felt like he was trying? Or do we disregard them at all as false pieces of evidence that these people were ever humane? I don't know, and that is why I can't answer the question I posed to myself. Do I regret reading this book? Would I read this book again? I in some ways feel like it's good to know what's out there, and if I ever have a conversation with a Tory who has read this, I'll be able to have a conversation with them about it and explain my concerns, and maybe some bits of praise scattered in there. But then at the same time, I really regret reading it because it kind of made me think more existentially about how people sometimes get worse with age, some people don't improve, and empathy isn't everything. I can't leave this on a very positive note while still being honest. But I can say being aware of this idea that just because you read books or you watch films about incredibly tragic things happen, and indeed even end up writing books where you empathize with people, still be on the watch for yourself being pulled in by power, being pulled in by defeatist thoughts about humans, and therefore starting to act in this really like selfish, stupid way. And I think that maybe these people have been pulled down by the skepticism that comes with knowing what the right thing to do is, but thinking it's not worthwhile doing. So I guess maybe, ironically, I'm going to quote Harry Potter and say constant vigilance for yourself, for others, knowing that empathy needs to turn into other things. You can't just turn empathy or satire into book sales and then be done with it. Like, it's a charged thing, and I think it can be put towards compassion and action, or it can almost pat you on the back too hard and be like, I don't need to try anymore, let's go have a gin in the garden while people literally die on my watch. Do you ever feel despair like this? Are there any of your heroes that you feel like have strayed to a different way of life and you don't really understand it, vent below, or perhaps give me some hope and some lessons from this experience. Do you read books by people you disagree with? I'd also like to hear about that. This has been a very ranty video. I've been negative in this one, but I promise you most of the time I am quite cheerful. Here are some ones where I am quite cheerful. Thank you so much for watching. Do subscribe if you'd like to be here again. I would certainly like to see you here again, because I promise I'll be more on top of the world next time. Frog Snug out.